In this short video, we're going to be painting this coastal scene, and I'm going to share with you some of my favorite seascape painting techniques. Roll that intro. I hope this video finds you well. My name's Andrew. Welcome back to the studio. Now, in this little video, we're going to be painting this coastal scene that can be found on the west coast of New Zealand. Now, you might remember this scene from a recent sketch endeavor video that I did on my channel, and I thought the drawing came out pretty good, so I thought I'd give the oil painting a go. Now, this panel is 7 by 14 inches, and so it's quite a small painting. And before we get stuck into the process here, let me share with you some of the colors that I'm using. On my palette, I have burnt umber, burnt sienna, transparent yellow oxide, Kremnitz white, cadmium lemon, cadmium red light, quinacridone magenta, ultramarine blue, and cobalt teal. And we can achieve quite a range with just that limited palette. Now, I'm also using some Winsor & Newton mediums. I'm using Liquin Original for the most of this painting, as well as Liquin Fine Detail and Liquin Impasto. And I'm going to give a few examples of how I use these mediums in this demonstration. Now, when I'm painting a scene such as this, I like to use quite a few reference images. I've never found just one picture that I wanted to copy exactly, so I use quite a few and just pick my favorite bits out of each photograph and then combine all these elements to create one unique image. And this is a way I really like to work in the studio. It keeps me on the imaginative side of things and creatively engaged. So here are some of the images that I'm using for this painting. And what I really like is how this beach leads the eye in to those waves in the distance. But I also like this area from another part of this coastline. I love the sea stacks getting pummeled by these huge waves. The only problem is that I didn't have access on the beach looking at those sea stacks. I was taking these photographs from a high vantage point looking down on them. So what I've used is a bit of creative imagination to combine these two different things to create a unique image. So now that we've got our colors, our mediums, and the photographic reference, let's paint that now. I'm working on a 7 by 14 inch homemade Belgian linen panel. This is lightly washed with a stain of burnt umber. And then I sketch my composition right over the top with a combination of burnt umber and quinacridone magenta. Once my composition is firmly established, I begin to apply the color, and I begin with whatever's furthest away first and work my way forward. So naturally, the sky is the first area that gets a coat of paint. Now this is blocking in / modeling, and if you've seen my other videos, you might be aware that I work in 3 stages. 1 is blocking in, 2 is modeling, and the third pass is the detail. Here, I'm more or less combining that blocking in and modeling section. So I'm applying a bit more refinement to some of the marks that I make. I'm using Winsor & Newton Liquin Original as my medium for this painting, so this layer is going to be nice and dry, ready for detail in the next sitting. Now, following along with that rule of thumb, working with whatever's furthest away, bringing the tiers of depth forward, I begin to work on those rock stacks that are out there in the distance, getting pummeled by the waves. Now, one of the things that I need to pay attention to here is the quality of those tones and the shadows. Notice how the tones here take a step down in value. They get darker as they come forward. Now, if I stick to this rule of thumb, I'm going to be able to create a sense of depth here within a 2-dimensional surface, and that depth will reveal itself relatively quickly. I then go about establishing this breaker that is smashing against this rocky sea stack by beginning with the shadows of the wave. I'm using some synthetics here, which are providing some nice, smooth, and flat brushwork. I'm paying very close attention to the quality of those marks, making sure that I have no ridge lines in that paint, as that will be hard to detail back over the top. Now, because this panel is so small, I try to be as precise as I can with my brushwork, even though I'm working relatively loose in this block-in / modeling phase. I continually reload my brush and apply these marks one tile of color at a time. To create this breaker, I apply deeper color down in the trough and fade this into a lighter yellow towards the top of the wave, and then bring a nice bright highlight along the top. I can then go back and adjust some of these areas with this synthetic brush, areas like the sky that might have a bit too much texture in it, so I can come back later and smooth this down with just a flat blade of that brush. And I continue with this technique in the trough of the wave as well. I'm thinking about having a nice surface to detail over the top, so if any ridge lines appear, they can get in the way later on in the process. A great combination for waves is transparent yellow oxide and cobalt teal. This creates a really nice, warm, and glowing green, perfect for these sunset coastal scenes. Now there's one rule when it comes to painting whitewater, and that is, whitewater is never white. We need to save our tonal best for last here and continually approach the top edge of our tonal range. So I'm holding back here and toning down the white on the palette by mixing in a slight amount of burnt umber and ultramarine blue, dropping the tone ever so slightly. Now the white here is primarily Krimnitz white, or a lead-based white. This I prefer to titanium white, as it helps me achieve some of those delicate tones from the outset. The brush I'm using is a synthetic ivory flat made by Rosemary & Co. And if you want to check out the brushes that I use, just simply click that link in the description down below. Now, as you can see, the painting's developing and I'm bringing this depth forward towards the viewer. So the next thing in line is this beach right here in front of the cliff to the right. Now, I'm beginning to establish some of those beach colors with some muted grays and browns, primarily burnt umber and a touch of burnt sienna, mixed in with plenty of white. This little squiggle here to the right is going to be a freshwater stream that cuts across the front of that cliff and exits into the ocean. I want this foreground to really lead the viewer into the scene, so I'm going to have quite a lot of texture here within this immediate foreground, and we're going to paint a very detailed pebble beach here. So it might help to have a bit more texture here in the immediate foreground, and that way I can build upon it with some individual pebbles. Now I really start to drop the tone with a combination of ultramarine blue and burnt umber. I'm mixing in a slight amount of that Krimnitz white so I don't have this go too dark. I still want some room to travel with those darker tones. But as I start to knock in the shadows here of this cliff, it's really starting to become dominant within the painting and leap well ahead of that stack that's there towards the left. I'm paying close attention to the types of patterns that I'm observing in that photographic reference. By just observing the way the rock behaves, I can afford to go off script here and there and start working out what the painting needs. It's not an exact copy of my photo, so to speak. I'm just taking my favorite aspects of that rocky texture and making sure that I include it here in this painting. There's no set rule for this kind of painting, but generally when I'm painting rocks like this, I like to work with that shadow first, then work in some midtones, and then preserve some area for some brighter highlights, like I'm adding now with the same ivory flat brush. Now what's cool about the West Coast is you get all sorts of interesting debris that washes up onto the beach. Some of this driftwood could have traveled from halfway across the world and ended up right here. And this provides a really interesting dynamic to also help lead that viewer into the scene. So these logs and sticks really follow that perspective and draw the eye towards the cliff to the right and then off into the composition. I go back over the painting the very next day. The surface is not 100% dry, it's just set up a little bit of a tack, certainly enough to accept a fresh layer of paint. This is one of the things I love about working with liquid, is that I can carry on with the painting relatively quickly and not have to wait days between layers. I'm taking cues from some of those abstract shapes that were provided by that initial block-in modeling layer, deepening some of the cloud shadows, and then this is inspiring where those highlights are going to go. I'm using some eclipse long filberts for layering back over the sky, and I'm also using some evergreen filberts and flats for layering back over this rocky sea stack. I'm going to begin by mixing up a nice cool tone, but deepen the shadow ever so slightly so it matches and sits a bit better in space with the rocky cliff to the right. I start to redefine where some of these cracks and crevices are going and paying attention to those midtones. Nothing here is going to be too dark or too light, but we still want to have plenty of texture and interest in this rock. Now with the highlight portion, I'm mixing up an interesting color here that is transparent yellow oxide burnt sienna, as well as a bit of that lead white, and then cooling this back down again with some of those blue notes given by ultramarine and cobalt teal. It's basically mud, but it looks pretty cool. Actually, that said, a lot of the colors that I use, as you can see on the palette on the right, are pretty drab and boring in isolation, but color is only the way it is relative to what it's around, so you can use other colors to really set off the dynamic. Something's only bright because it's next to something dark, or it's only colorful and intense because it's next to something desaturated. So I'm playing these relationships off against one another constantly to create interest.
Wow!
Now, one of my favorite brushes for detailing is this ivory dagger. This is a very small synthetic brush, perfect for those intricate marks. So I'm using this to not only establish some of the highlights at the top of the wave, but also some of the white water in the trough, as well as some of those deeper green notes. Also, synthetic rounds are great for applying some of these scallop spiderweb-like shapes that really define the overall form of the wave. I use quite a few of these synthetic rounds towards the end of the process. Now to create some more random marks, I use an old bristle brush with those fibers splayed apart, and this can create some really nice random marks, perfect for that splash. I then go back and readjust and define some of these areas again with that synthetic pointed round. Now generally with a painting this size, I can finish the piece in about 2 to 3 sittings. I tend to lump together that blocking in and modeling part of the process and then just carry straight on with detail after that block-in modeling section has dried. This allows me to get through work a little bit quicker in the studio. Now because I was holding back with my tones in the beginning, it allows some of these lighter marks applied with a synthetic round to stand proud of that surface and start to create some more texture here of that white water catching the light. For my highlights, I mix just a little bit of titanium white in with that Kremnitz white. This creates a bit more brightness with my highlight colors. Now just like with the water in the sky, this area in the foreground is dry enough to go ahead and layer over the top and start to create some more intricate detail. This is really going to draw the viewer into the painting, and it's going to take quite a while to apply all of these intricate little details. What I'm going to attempt to do here is communicate this pebble-like texture. And there's only one way to do this, and that's to just go in with a pointed round and carve out one stone at a time. But before I get really stuck into this technique, I want a touch more texture in this cliff here to the right. I'm taking a straight combination of ultramarine blue and burnt umber without any of that added white, and notice here how much of a deeper tone this is from that initial shadow color. This contrast, given by the depth of the tone, creates more texture and interest here in these shadow portions. Now often when we're painting from photographs, a lot of the details in the shadows drop away completely because our cameras are only adjusted for those highlight colors. But I like to make sure I always have enough detail in not only the highlights, but the shadows as well. So I've added in some of these cooler notes from that ambient skylight that has been reflected from above. Then sporadically with a synthetic round, I add a touch more texture to the lead edge that is catching that light. The detail phase is all about texture, so to apply more body to the paint, I'm using liquid impasto medium. Now this little freshwater stream is loaded with tannins because it's coming out of a forest, I imagine, that is somewhere off to the right of the composition. But it's far too red for this scene and it seems quite out of place. I'm going to tone it down by applying some ultramarine blue over the top and dropping the tone significantly. And as I do this, it begins to match a little better with that cliff that it's immediately in front of. I need a slight shadow here of this little lip of sand that's being eroded away by that freshwater stream, so I mix up some ultramarine blue and burnt umber, touch of quinacridone magenta, and apply this in with a flat synthetic brush. Once this body of water has been established, I can go back and apply some little ripples over the top. Just a slight contrast will do with some of those lighter blue marks, and then I go over the top with some crisp, brilliant little white highlights. I tentatively applied some of these darker marks where these stones were going to be strewn across the beach here in the foreground. But now I feel like I really need to increase the level of texture here to really engage the viewer and draw them into this painting. I begin by mixing some of that impasto texture in with some of these lighter gray notes, and then I apply the stone shadows just directly over the top of this. Now that texture really helps me in providing some interest here in the foreground. Once I've established the shadows cast by each individual stone, I can then go about applying a highlight to the lead edge. And for this, I'm using a trimmed synthetic round because I needed something just a bit finer than the detail brushes that I had. I'm trying to keep within the laws of perspective here and have some of these bigger stones in the immediate foreground and then have these trail off in terms of their scale as we go into the painting. So this will help draw the viewer's eye a little bit more, along with some of these wispy bits of white water that are washing up onto the beach. It is my hope that it's the combination of these techniques that will really provide that depth. Now finally, I want to have a touch more atmosphere, so I'm going to apply a glaze to the sky. Now anytime you apply a glaze, your painting has got to be completely touch dry, and I'm using liquid fine detail, lead white, and just a touch of transparent yellow oxide. This is providing a really nice warm yellow flush to the atmosphere that's closest to the horizon. And then with a very fine pointed round, I re-establish some of that brilliant green just at the top of the breaking wave and just get a punch of color within this scene. The wave, after all, is the most important element within this painting, so I want to make sure it becomes bright enough to really command attention within the composition. Well, I'm really happy with the way this little study turned out, and I really hope that you've enjoyed watching the process for how I created this painting. Now, again, if you have any questions about the materials that I'm using throughout my demonstrations, links to those can always be found in the description down below. Make sure you check out Blue Ridge Handmade Oils and Rosemary & Co. brushes. Now, if you enjoyed the process of this painting, this is actually going to be a freebie for my subscribers when I release my full seascape painting tutorial. That's coming out very, very soon. So if you want to be amongst the first to know about that, make sure you're subscribed through my website at andrewtischler.com/subscribe. It's absolutely free to do so. You'll find that link down in the description below as well. Now, thank you so much for stopping by. I've really enjoyed your company. If you liked this video, then click that like button for me and leave me a comment down below. Make sure you're subscribed to this channel and click that notification icon so you're notified when I upload another video. Now, you can find me on social media. I'm on Instagram and Facebook. Those links are down below as well. Thank you so much for stopping by. I'll see you again soon.